Hello, my name is Ty Heath. I'm the former president of LinkedIn's Black Inclusion Group, co-founder of the LinkedIn Transform Her conference, and I'm director of market engagement at our LinkedIn B2B Institute, where we work with practitioners of marketing and academics to explore how marketers can provide more value. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So we know the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion is strong. The case has been proven out time and time again. It really begs the question, if we know this case to be true, then why don't we always see the action we would expect from experts to accept those findings? We want to see progress. And so, with the help of marketing and behavioral science, we're going to venture into the gap and explore how we can overcome those obstacles and really invest in a world where we can have equity every day. So everyone, please join me in welcoming my fellow panelists. We've got Jamila Bowman-Williams, Professor Jamila Bowman-Williams from Georgetown Law, and Jackson Janayagam, General Manager, Vice President, Clorox.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Can we just take a second? Can we just take a second? We're here.
Yes.
In person.
In person.
I like this. Hi, Ad Color. We're here. Okay, I know you both, but I want this audience to get to know you as well. So let's do that. So Jamila, we'll start with you. I've been following your work for some time and admiring your work. When I saw your paper on the principal practice gap, I was like, that's the thing. We need more people to know about this and understand the research. You have all the degrees. So let me get this right. You have a JD from Stanford Law and a PhD in sociology from Stanford as well. And you do research on bias, anti-discrimination. And I'm just wondering, did you know we were going to be here having this conversation? Was all of that in preparation for today and this work? Tell us a little bit more about what got you into the work.
Oh, sure. Okay, so let me go back. So I guess I've always really been attached to my community just from a very early age and what's going on in my community. I've always had everything I need, but I come from a family that didn't. So my parents grew up very poor, like no running water kind of poor. So I guess my dad always taught me who I am, and where I came from. So we come from a place, I'm a Midwest girl, y'all. So we came from a place called Saginaw, Michigan, Sag Nasty. Anyone know? Okay. So, but really there is there aren't a lot of opportunities. So especially back when my parents were growing up, if you come out of there, you're considered lucky. So I always was looking around my family and my community, and I knew a lot of it was just due to circumstance, Right. So yes, I could make it out. My family made it out. However, there are so many other people with just poor educational opportunities, living in poverty, trying to put food on the table, trying to survive, really. No health care, no jobs, and you have incarceration and violence. So I guess all of that really just lit a fire in me from a very early age, and I did a lot of mentoring. I did a lot of working with youth, a lot of teaching. So that's part of why I teach now. And then eventually it got me to the research that I do. And a lot of the things I just mentioned are structural racism, that's what it is. So then how do we start to dismantle structural racism? If we see what it's doing, then how do we start dismantling it, and how do we level the playing field? So I guess it's always kind of been a part of who I am, and now I just research on it.
I can see it. It definitely shows, your experience shows, and we'll talk more because it definitely shines through in the work you've been doing. And so Jackson, let's meet Jackson. So Jackson, a little bit brag on both of you throughout this conversation, but just want to share with the audience, you have 20 years of experience in change management from digital to CMO. You have worked at the intersection of understanding brands and audiences as well. And folks, he's been called a disruptor by Forbes. We like this. We like this. And I've also heard you stress the importance of honesty. So I've heard this in statements you've made, and it really does feel like courage is in your DNA. So tell us a little bit more about you. Where does all of that come from? What drives you, and why are you here for this conversation?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I was telling you it's kind of nice to be around people who aren't 3 feet tall that I'm related to. Like, change of pace to get out of my apartment, to be with adults, so thank you all for being here. So I'm a son of immigrants, I'm an only child. My parents, I was telling you earlier, escaped a war in Sri Lanka when I was 1, and we got asylum here, and then we got booted after 14 years. And my dad's job was like literally to clean up drinking water. That's what he does. But he wasn't good enough to stay here. So we got booted and we left, and like going through all that, like I had my first experience in Southern Virginia is where I was raised with racism at 5 or 6, but I didn't know it was racism. I didn't know, right? I remember dealing with all that, and that kind of really sparked something, I think. I mean, I kept dealing with it throughout many, many years. And for me, like that just carried with me, like this sense of like belonging. I never fit in anywhere. I was always like, I looked like some people, I didn't look like others. No one knew what to do with me, and my name's a whole other thing. So yeah, like I'm passionate about the topic. I'm passionate about sharing, and that courage. I wouldn't say I'm courageous. I just feel like people should do the right thing more often. I truly believe more people are good than bad. I really believe in the goodness of people, even though there's some bad examples out now on social media and so forth. And I feel like it's my duty in whatever role I'm in to try to do better and to try to say a thing that maybe someone else doesn't feel comfortable saying, or maybe they're not in a position where they can say it. So like I've always tried to be a straight shooter, and what you see is what you get, and you might like me, you might not. Most people don't always like me. But to me, that's really important. And I learned that the hard way too. So it just kind of started young. And I just always want to say, if I leave a room, I leave a situation, I can say, I was real. I was who I was, and it might not be for everyone, but at least I feel good about that. I can sleep. And for my 2 daughters, I have a 2- and 6-year-old who are biracial also, and that's really important for them to see that. I need them to know that that's how they need to feel confident in that. So that's really important to me.
That's wonderful. Yeah, how you show up paves the way for other people that look like you, like us, to be able to show up as well. And when we show up courageously, it gives people also the permission and the validation and the courage to do that as well. So I love what you said there. So let's actually venture into the gap. I want to talk a little bit about your research, and then I would love for you to share some insights from your leadership, from the role that marketers can play to transform things as well. So in your research, you talk about something called the principal practice gap. And as we've talked about it, we've talked about what we see to be a knowledge action gap between how people think about handling diversity, equity, inclusion or not. So can you share, let's define it for the audience. What is the principal practice gap?
Sure.
And how does it stop progress?
Okay, sure. All right, so the principal practice gap, it builds on this sociological concept of the principal policy gap. So you all have seen it. So this is when people believe in something, a value or an ideal in theory or in principle, yet they don't necessarily support the types of policies that are required to advance that type of goal or ideal. So that's the principal policy gap. So I like to use education as an example. People like to talk about schools and they get that. So, people will say they believe in diversity and equal opportunity. They want their children to go to diverse schools, but do they support the redistricting plan that would allow some of those Black students or low-income students to come to their wealthy and advantaged school? And then it's, nah. That's going to bring our test scores down, and we need our test scores to stay at the top. So that policy, they're not into that policy though. All right. Okay. Well, how about just giving some scholarships so that they can come over and attend your STEM program after school? Oh, no, because, scholarships shouldn't be based on race though. And plus that's a bad school, and we'll have behavioral problems, our students can't learn. So you get what I'm saying. So there's a disconnect between what they say that they believe in and what they actually support to do that. And I just take it a step further and look at the principal practice gap. So now this is particularly post George Floyd, everyone wants to start the dialogue about equity and inclusion and belonging and social justice and all of these things. They're also supporting some of the policies now. All right, so think about the workplace space. We're seeing more DEI programs. We're seeing more affinity groups, more diversity committees, all of these things. But what are people doing when they actually have the opportunity to act, to take a concrete step or action to broaden opportunity or give someone access or lift someone up who hasn't traditionally been lifted up. All right, and then here we see a disconnect as well with that. So across my research, right now it's looking like over 80% believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're saying, yes, we should have all of these programs and things, but when you look to see who's gonna actually give that bonus, for example, they may not want to give that bonus though, or maybe they just might give the very lowest end of that. They're not giving the top end of that bonus that the white people are getting, the white men are getting, for example. Or they might not still be ready to put that woman of color on the leadership team so that she can shine and thrive. So that's the principal practice gap where we're seeing that a lot, where people say, you know, and it's confusing sometimes because they'll seem like buy-in. You see the DEI and the diversity talk everywhere. So people are talking the diversity talk, but they aren't walking the walk. So we need more disruptors, like what Jackson was saying, people disrupt it and change it up and actually be willing to take those concrete steps.
Yeah, so if I understand you, there's something operating in the background that's stopping people from taking that action, and we definitely want to dive into that. So thank you for that. It's a gap between someone's real and their stated preferences is what we're hearing. So Jackson, you've heard what Jamila said, and I want to share a little bit more about your background because I think is relevant here. So I know you've also studied sociology, communications. I know you had a focus on race relations as well. So you've actually really gone into this topic into notable roles. I know also, I understand you're tattooed brown man. You show up, right? As fully as yourself. I want to understand, what has that journey been like for you? And in your experience, have you felt the obstacles and the conversations you've had in various journeys, whether it was like in race relations work that you've had to tackle or in your leadership position in marketing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like, I feel lucky too, because I've been in a position and my parents were able to help me a little bit getting through college. So I was in a position a lot of people aren't, right? So, but I was not a good student. I was like a 2.5 student. I had no chance of going and getting my MBA. I didn't even want to. It's just not, I'm not me. That's not me. So I had to figure that out. But, you know, the challenge is sometimes, most of the time, you actually don't even know the opportunities you're missing because no one will give you that second look, right? You just won't ever get the opportunity because your name shows up one way. They assume certain things about you. I can't tell you how many people assume I don't speak English when I've had conversations with someone, like, or when did you learn to speak English? Your English is really good. I'm like, thanks, so is yours, right? It's like,
why wouldn't it be
why
right?
would mine not be good? Like, you know? So, I mean, my whole career, it's kind of been like that. But to be honest, like, you know, the tattoos, like, you know, listen, like, not for nothing. Like, I'm a brown man with tattoos, and I didn't become an engineer or teacher. Like, I'm the biggest disappointment to my parents. Like, I literally, like, could not have done it worse. They don't even understand what I do. I mean, I'm constantly explaining to them what I do, and then the tattoos, I have to hide it half the time, right? So it's even in my own family, I dealt with that. But for me, this is an important way for me to express myself. But it's not just about myself. As I moved up in my career, you know, everyone in your 20s, I feel like it's always about yourself, right? But then you get to a certain point, you have a responsibility as a manager, as a leader, to help instill that, whatever your values are. For me, values are equity and equality, and giving people, everyone should have an opportunity. And if everyone has an opportunity, and then it's about performance and all that, but you have to enable the environment, allow people to come in and and create equal footing so that, hey, are we recruiting from the same school? Well, maybe that's a problem, right? Like, one of the things I get frustrated about as I built teams is people will talk about culture, but the first 4 letters of culture are probably the scariest words, and that's what happens. Oftentimes in a homogeneous environment, you build a cult because people self-select. It's human nature, right? You gravitate towards what you are comfortable with, who you know. Animals do it too. Humans do it too. We're no different. So if you work in an environment that's all white men, not a shock that when they start hiring, it's like, oh, that person's not a culture fit. And that's one thing. If you guys ever, this is one actionable thing. If you're ever in a situation where someone on your team says they're not a culture fit, break it down, make them break it down. Like, specifically tell me, because oftentimes what that means, sometimes maybe they're not right for the work environment because the skill sets, whatever. A lot of times that means they don't look like us, they don't talk like us, they don't act like us, they didn't come from the same school as us. And that took me, in my 20s and early 30s, I would say they're not a culture fit. And then as I thought about it, and I would have these conversations with friends, and my friend group is broad spectrum of people, and from different industries, half of them don't even work corporate, they work like, you know, hourly jobs. I'm like, oh shit, that's a real fucked up saying. Right. Culture fit is one of the worst things in cultures. So if you get a chance, I've been trying to eradicate that word from my team's vocabulary. So I've been trying to say environment and complement, addition, and probably we should be looking for more complements and additions, not more fits, because then you get really bad situations. And then everyone looks around, it's like, how come we don't have more diversity? It's like, well,
Yes.
because you ruled out a lot of great effing candidates because you said they weren't a culture fit. You couldn't even describe what it is other than they didn't look like you.
Right. Yeah. I always, whenever I've heard that in the past, it's something that makes you cringe.
It's crazy.
You definitely feel that, and you feel it's definitely the divide there that it creates. And so let's actually look at the divide a little bit more. So, Jamila, the case for equity has been made a certain way for some time. And we know that there's something in the gap. And I want to start to explore, bias. Jackson raised also just in the way that people think, the cult in culture that tends to happen to businesses. What do we see that's in the way that people talk about it, the case that's being made that's breaking down, where we're not seeing the action being taken in the way that case is being communicated?
Sure. Well, the dominant case that we always hear is the business case for diversity, right? So we know there's a business case. We've heard it over and over and over. But what's interesting is we aren't talking about the business case here. Okay, we know there's a business case, like we know our worth and we know our value, but this is the way that it always has to be sold, right? We have to sell why our identity brings value, why we as a woman of color, an immigrant, why we're gonna make you more money, why we're gonna help you become more innovative, get better teams, and make better decisions, all of these things, serve your clients better. So while all of these things happen, this case is not translating. For some reason, it's not hitting. The messaging isn't working. So people will say, yeah, they'll say they buy into that. But again, there's the gap where they're not acting on it. When you look at people who believe in that business case, they state they support that business case, it's not predicting their action in terms of who they promote, who they put on the team, how they're compensating people. Okay, so it may be a little bit of the numerical diversity at the entry level. They might say, okay, well, let's fix these formulas. So we might have a few tokens here. So then that will give us, some of these rewards that they say are out there. But it's not really, people aren't internalizing it. So I think part of it is just the way we're framing it. It shouldn't be about business, always about business outcomes. Although we know there's value in it, it shouldn't be about that all the time. So I think part of that messaging is problematic, and it can also be a problem where then you're asked to show up in a certain way or perform a certain thing or bring a certain perspective and all of this, when we know how much range there is across our identity groups and how many different perspectives and how many different backgrounds even within our community. So I don't know, I think that is part of the message that's problematic, and we need to find something that's different. The other thing about that's problem is it gives this illusion of fairness as well. So it makes it sound like the companies are prizing these people from these candidates from this background, and then other people, who are making the decisions, they aren't necessarily checking their biases because they think that, okay, well, they think they're better and they're great and all of this, and I'm not sure that's the case, but they can do the diversity work. And they can make sure they do that, but they're not necessarily then checking what they do when they're interacting or deciding how to make their teams work. So anyway, I think that's one of the issues with the messaging.
Yeah, and can you touch a little bit more on the bias that might be running in the background? So I know one of the things that comes to mind for a lot of people is conversation about zero-sum. So that one's very relevant in today's environment, the political environment. A gain for one group is a loss for another group. And these are some of the things that might be operating. Can you share maybe a couple of them that are preventing folks or keeping folks maybe stuck? Or maybe they don't even, it's unintentional often, correct?
Sometimes it can be unconscious, yes. So zero-sum definitely is an issue. So as Ty mentioned, that's when people think that, okay, well, if that group gains, then I'm gonna lose something, or my group is gonna lose something. So some examples, so if these admission slots go to these people, then I'm not gonna have a chance at those, or my group or my children aren't gonna have a chance at those, or if the funding goes there, we aren't gonna have the funding, or if the diversity recruiter goes and talks to Keisha, then Beth may not get hired. So, so it's the idea that there has to be a loss, and the loss aversion is really deep, because we have to remember that the people who are in power and who have had these privileges, they've had these privileges for generation after generation after generation. Okay, so these these are privileges and resources that have been systematically allocated and kept with white people. That's real. So they're going to feel some loss aversion. They're going to feel some zero sum and some tension. Even if they say they care about it, they're going to feel that, and that can like keep them from actually acting in some ways, because they don't want to lose those advantages at the end of the day. So that's how that tends to be how that plays out. And we're seeing this a lot. I mean, you could just turn on the news and see. So, of course, we're in this social justice era. After George Floyd was murdered, we saw the uprising, the protests, all of that. And then now, not even a year later, or within a year, then there's this anti-critical race theory. You can't even talk about race. So it opened dialogue, but then now we can't even talk about the inequalities that we see. Right? And then we have voter suppression laws. So, you want to defund the police? Okay, you want police reform? We're gonna keep you from voting. We're gonna change these things. There's anti-protest legislation. So I guess a lot of this is just cycles that we see repeated throughout history, and a lot of it has to do with that threat and that perception that something has to be lost. I think that either intentionally in some cases, or even unintentionally or unconsciously can keep people from acting.
Ty, can I add something to that?
Please, yes.
So we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of explicit examples of that, but there's also subtle examples of this. So I was telling you about hiring. So I probably hired, I don't know, definitely interviewed thousands of people over the last 15 years, right, and hired hundreds. And I could tell you consistently with really good data that over and over again, people of color and women, and especially women of color, will come in always way lower than a white man and a white female, but white females are also pretty low. White men will always come in higher in terms of their ask, right? So I'll have a budget of X dollars, and I'll say, what's your salary expectation? And it's constant. It is constant as sure as like the sun will come out eventually. Same thing. It's like 20, 30% less. So oftentimes I will actually say like, well, we can go a little bit higher. This is where our budget was. But on the flip side, white men will not only come in at the highest rate, they'll come in and negotiate way harder. Whereas often people of color, and especially women of color, like consistently will not negotiate. And it obviously we all know there's parity in pay between gender and race, and especially if you're a female of color in corporate society. But I can tell you for a fact, it is so hard once you're in to be able to negotiate more money. It's just so hard. Your best power of leverage is when you're outside, when they want you. And yeah, if you're entry level, this is tough, right? You're out of college, everyone needs a job. But if you have a few years, I'm looking around the room, since a lot of you guys are experienced, it's amazing like how many people don't negotiate. And I think there's a psychology built in, because either they were underpaid at their last place, there's been like this societal impact, like I can't ask for more, I'm lucky enough to have this job, so I'm not gonna negotiate harder. Whereas that entitlement with white men constantly, it's crazy. They'll negotiate down to like a penny, but the women of color especially never negotiate and always lowball themselves in the beginning. So I think there's opportunity for training and education to empower them to negotiate more, because once you're at that stage, you have the leverage, right? In theory, you have the leverage, but there's a psychology in place, I think, as a result of some of the things Jamel was talking about.
And some of this is systemic, though, y'all. I'm like, we can't put this all on the person who we know is being underpaid and we know is suffering from the bottom end of that pay gap. Some of this, like these structures, if they're saying they care about equity, they should not let that continue to happen where they know that's continuing to create this divide over time, where they're not valuing the talent in the same way, and a lot of it is based on the skin color. And also, I will say, white men are treated differently when they negotiate compared to when a woman of color negotiates. Like, we're looked at like, oh, she's asking, and is she gonna be, is she gonna come in with that attitude when she comes on the team, when the white man can come and do it, and it's like accepted, like that's part of the game. So I just wanna make sure we also look at the structural and the systemic in addition to the individual responsibility for negotiating.
Yeah, it's so important to look at the historical context, and I think the point of this entire conversation about equity every day is to also think about the very human things, as we said, that they're operating in the background, the amount of socialization that takes place on a daily basis that impacts how we show up, the asks that are made, the way that we're received when those asks are made. Absolutely. And to your point, Jackson, I think there's a whole lot more that could be done for folks that understand these structures to be true, to support.
Well, and it's also having a difficult conversation, because while I said it's hard once you're inside, if you really care about it, if you prioritize from the top, you'd be looking at your whole employee base saying, are we seeing these discrepancies and calling it out, right? Like I was talking to you earlier, like
Exactly.
I do think we get to a place where there's salary transportation, where you could, transparency, where you can see everyone's salary. That's the only way, because otherwise it's hidden conversations, right? It's like someone has someone championing for them for whatever the reasons are, right? That we all know that are said or unsaid. But if it's out there, then it's very hard to hide behind that. And then you're holding people accountable. It's like, well, how come all the black female engineers are making 30% less than the Asian male engineers and 40% less than the white male engineers, right? That's one example. It happens all the time in tech, right? Facebook, Google, it happens, right? Probably one of the sponsors here. I'm not going to get a job there anytime soon. So, but like that happens all the time. But honestly, people are scared of this salary transparency. But if you really break down who's the most scared of it, it's generally the same group of people. It's never the minorities. It's never the women who are scared of that, because that just puts it out there. So that's the only way I think we're going to get to a place where you have to call out and have those hard discussions, even if it makes people feel awkward. Like, put my salary out there. Like, let's talk about this and let's make sure that we're paying people what they deserve to pay based on their experience and level and their performance.
Can we stay on this for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think part of what we need to think about how we transform, it's not just what we say out in the market. I know we're marketers, but we can also impact things internally within our organization. So Jackson, for you, how is it that you have these types of conversations with your team, with other parts of the business, with brand, with sales, with how do you play a role in transforming an internal culture? That's a big,
It is.
it's a big question. What can you actually do?
But I'm not going to tell you Clorox is doing anything right. We do a lot of things wrong. We fuck up a lot. And I'm like, yeah, we could do a lot better. Like that's the truth. Like for no, like, oh my God, they're doing everything right. Like I think Netflix has done some really good things. I think other companies have done some good things. We're not there, right? My team is a little unique. We're kind of like a rogue team. There's like 100 of us. My team's 80% women, almost 50% people of color. We still, and no one should, like, that's not meant to be like an applause. It should be like, that's a starting point. That's good. We need to do better. We need to keep at it. But I use that as an example. Like, we're an Oakland-based company. We have a New York office. We have offices in Atlanta. We have offices in some of the most diverse cities in the country. There should be no excuse why we're not doing better. And people often focus on hiring, but it's amazing. Like, you have a lot of employees already there. Why aren't you focused on promoting? How come all the promotions have gone to certain people and haven't gone to others? And it goes all the way to the top, right? Like at the C-suite, the general manager level, and on the board level. No one ever talks about the boards when that's really where the opportunities are, right? But they need to be created, because to get to that level, that's all like, those are like, used to be a very like, old school boys club kind of conversations, like private, like very hard to get into those circles. So there needs to be a place where it's a training ground internally. You get there and I'm going to have an equal shot as anyone else to get all the way to the top. So those are conversations I have with my CEO. I remember having the first one-on-one with her when she took over, and she's a female CEO, is 43. So that's kind of rare in the Fortune 500 world. But I said, Linda, like, I look around and like literally all the GMs, I'm the only person of color. It's 8 men, 1 woman, and me. And all the senior executives, it's 15 of them. Yeah, it's 7 women, so that's great, but 1 person of color. And she's like, we do need to do better. I recognize it. And I will say, I give them credit, they own that, but it's slow. And it's like, but if you really want to do it better, why isn't it tied to people's performance goals? That's how you make it actionable, right? Like, oh, well, your recruitment numbers look like this, and you recruited 80% of your new hires or promotions were white people. So if you can incentivize people and make it actually tied to performance goals, where you're truly driving the business forward and improving diversity, not only from the existing employee pool, but also from the outside, those are ways I think that, and I've talked about this with them, like, why aren't we doing that? But it still feels like a lot of talk, and that's where I get frustrated, and I'm, probably not gonna get promoted too often saying these kind of things, but I don't care, because like, I got 10, 15 more years of working. I'll probably be dead in 25 years. Like, I'm gonna do what I can to make an impact. I'm gonna say what I feel, because that's the right thing. If you agree with me or not, I don't give a fuck. Like, but that's the right thing to do, right?
And they lose if they don't do this. That's the reality.
I know,
if they don't promote you, or if they, like, look at all the talent and the brilliance out here. Like, they're the ones losing. You're helping them at the end of the day.
Like, we lost people, 74 million people voted for Trump. I thought it was obvious, like, why would you vote for him? You're not gonna vote for him, and then you vote for him a second time. Some things I think are so obvious, you know how it is, right? It's just like, but yet, to some people, they don't really care. They just don't. At the end of the day, people don't care. And that's why I heard the previous speaker was talking about money. Money is the one thing that drives it, right? So how the money is spent, where it goes, and that's the thing. It's like, we got to figure that out, right? Because that's what moves people. Otherwise, I feel like nothing changes,
And the money isn't moving either with the business case.
Yeah, so
that's
let's talk about that a little bit more. Because I want to stay on this, because I think one of the conversations or the undercurrents is that there are a lot of different things that have been done and we aren't seeing movement. I think the courage and having accountability and having the conversations, there's no transformation without conversations in the first place. But there are still things, that are preventing the progress. We see money being spent. I think I saw a stat that said like $49 billion were contributed from brands in the aftermath of George Floyd. And we want to make sure that money actually results in forward motion, real transformation. Part of it is that the communication isn't landing somehow. It's breaking down. We know that we've now learned that there's bias in the balance between. Is there anything else you can tell us about is it the communication in addition to the money? Is it the money? Like where is the breakdown? And then I really want you to talk about this because I found this so fascinating in your research about the colorblind conundrum that you found in terms of how things were framed in that language. If I need to repeat anything, let me know because I know I gave you a lot.
Yes, that's a lot. Okay, let's start with the colorblind conundrum.
Okay.
So, because you all have heard this, and this is another way, another narrative people use to justify their inaction, okay? Why they don't give that bonus, why they didn't put that person on the leadership team, why they didn't expose them to this, they exposed this person to the opportunity, but not this person. And a lot of it is that, you'll hear people say they don't see race, they aren't racist, they just want the best person for the job. They just want the most qualified. It's all about performance. And you hear this over and over, and it's very rational, so it's hard to question it. And they're saying that it's not based on color, but they're also not acknowledging the systemic inequalities that we're seeing. So they're acting like that doesn't exist and that it's all about merit. And what you also see is these shifting notions of merit. Okay, so what's important varies and changes depending on who they really want to put in that spot. So I'll just give you an example for, when it comes to being about qualifications and merit. So say there is a spot on a team and the team needs someone who has good writing skills, has some experience. So I'm going to make up names. So say when Keisha is the best writer out of the pool and she's been at the company, but she may not have as much experience. And they're like, yeah, she's a good writer, but we really need the experience, right? So then they say, okay, we're going to pick Beth instead because she has the experience we need. But then it flips, it's like, okay, well, Keisha has the experience, but her writing skills, she doesn't have quite as many, written products, but she has the experience. And it's like, oh, yeah, but we really need the strong writer. This is really a writing role. So anyway, I'm just giving you all of the narratives that you hear. So in my research, I do qualitative research too, where I hear people talk about why they think diversity is important for one, but then why they don't act or why they promote one person or why they put one person on the team and not another. And you hear this over and over. So you study sociology and race relations. So this really, I didn't make this up. This came back from a classic book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He's at Duke University. It's called Racism Without Racists. So why are we still seeing all of these inequities over and over again? The compensation disparities, promotion disparities, the hiring disparities. We all see it and we feel it, but yet no one wants to take responsibilities. They're all saying that it's because of the merit and these very rational explanations. So that's the colorblind conundrum, and that one is hard. I think part of it is because it's hard to question that, and you're like, okay, well, maybe we'll get that person of color next time. But like the black and brown person always seems to be missing something. It's always an explanation of why they don't have enough, no matter how qualified they are. So I think we have to start asking those questions, and it is tough. Like, why? Like you said, why don't they have that fit? If fit is so subjective, right? Why don't you think they have the fit? Or why last time you said this was important? Why is this now so important? And there's always some movement. So anyway, I think we need to start asking more questions and challenging that status quo more. And then for mitigating the bias, what do we do? All of this, we've been talking a lot about individual biases and behaviors, whether it be unconscious or conscious, like how do we get people to act? But also, like, we need to change these systems altogether, right? We need to disrupt and change and shake up these whole structures. So you talked about the rules, so our practices, our procedures, not our DEI stuff, but just generally how we hire and promote. So that tap on the shoulder, the old boys network, or young boys now we have in tech, you know, and banking and law is young boys network often. But then you see the same thing reproduced, white male again and again and again, right? So how are we doing promotions? Who's really being developed and looked at for that talent? Who's been exposed for the promotions? Who's being put on those teams where they get to go meet with the top clients, and then they can get the performance reviews that have said how they did with those top clients. So a lot of it is just how all of these opportunities are allocated and changing the systems of how we're doing that. You might have a formal mentoring program, but who's really being sponsored behind the scenes? So taking a closer look, even if there's a DEI like recruitment or mentoring program, really take a closer look at what's happening on the ground, and then that has to all shake up a little bit in order for these other individual things to change in terms of the action and the concrete steps.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hearing you say we need to come at it at the systems level.
Yes.
It can't just be a conversation. We really need to look at the system, how things operate, how they've been operating, and start to make some changes there. And so just to stay on this, what do we do piece, Jackson, I think there's a lot that marketing and communications leaders can do as well. I mean, we are responsible for so many communications on a regular basis, how people see themselves, that their communication really shapes the world. What can we do to start to shift and maybe even help people overcome some of these biases and even empower, the audiences of the future to really feel like that role is a role that I can have?
Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, I feel like we could spend an hour just talking about that.
Yeah,
like, for instance, if any of you are client side and you have an agency, I would look at your account and creative team. Like, I don't see much diversity in my creative team, but yet half the people spending buying our products are people of color, or Black women, or immigrant families. Why? But my whole creative team is all a bunch of people who look the same, right? So I think if you are in a client side, that's one actionable thing you can do. Like, call that out, right? I spent 15 years in an agency. And I was always amazed, how come there's like no people of color in advertising? It just feels like, or at least at the highest levels, ECD, GCD, the roles that really, really matter and drive the impact. But yet you're speaking to a group that you can't even relate to. I've always found that kind of fascinating, crazy. But I also think it is, if you're in the marketing side, you're in-house, it is the people you cast for your creative, the people you are writing for, where you're buying your media, right? Like, there are so many. I mean, 15 years ago, you had the same networks you're buying from, right? So it was very tough. That's where the reach was. But now you have access to different kinds of people you can cast, different kinds of networks and publishers, Black-owned, minority-owned communities and networks have huge reach. So just prioritizing those channels, digital and otherwise, to make sure that brand, that message is getting out there, making sure the people who reflect that brand look like the folks you're talking to, right? Because for so long, it would always be the same people. How many times did we grow? I grew up watching TV, and I never saw anyone look like me, ever, right? But yet, they wanted my dollars, they wanted my money, right? And they were kind of targeting me, but no one looked like me. I'm sure many of you had that same experience. So I think just calling that out specifically, like, we had this conversation actually at our side with one of our brands. It was like, well, 50% of our audience are women of color. We know that. But yet, we have not had a woman of color in any of the creative. Why is that? I mean, no one had an answer. It was just like, oh, we didn't even realize, right? Whether it's conscious or subconscious, I don't know. So I think it's calling it out and making that case for it. And I know that again, it's hard, right? I get that. But there's also data that proves it. Yes. So how can you refute the data? It's not like I'm just saying that'd be nice to have. There's hard data that proves that that actually will drive business results and drive revenue. And by the way, this is the audience we're talking to already. But yeah, we're not relating to them. So I think those are the very specific things that I've seen that we need to be better at as a marketing group and marketing community.
Can I add on to this?
Please.
Because this is so important, and it ties back to the systemic things we're talking about. And you mentioned it earlier in terms of the pay. Things aren't going to change until we have more transparency. Where are those dollars going? Who is on those teams? Why are there why does it look like that versus something else? Why are these gaps there? And some accountability. So we don't have enough accountability and transparency at the end of the day in many of these cases. So like, that's the starting point that everyone can push for and say, let us see the data, let us see the numbers, show everyone, show the world, but they don't want to show the world. You know why? Because then they'll start getting pushback. Why does your team always look like this? It hasn't ticked up in 40 years, right? but you're saying all this about DEI and all these commitments and all the solidarity. Why don't you have women on your board? Oh, you put one woman, you can only find one woman qualified to sit on your board, right? So this is why a lot of it is like they try to keep it in secrecy. So we need to change that. We need more transparency. We need it to be more public, and we need more public accountability around these steps and what's happening internally. So I think that would be a good step too.
Right. And I think this is also why you're starting to see people taking it into their own hands. Like they've almost given up in corporate, and you're starting to see VC funds and private equity firms being built up by people of color, by women, only to invest in people of color and women. And like, I think we need a lot more of that, because
I love this.
Arguably,
yes.
that might be, I hate to say it, that might be the way to really create the change.
I know,
that's where the
we
money
hate
is.
to say that because we work for these institutions, y'all, and these organizations that are sponsoring us to be here. But yes, we can own our own stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can take our talent and
And I think the more that happens, and the more we can support those companies and all those, there's a shitload of startups now that are like, they could use our dollars and they could use our spend. So if you have a choice of what brand to buy and what, like, whether it's soap or food or whatever thing is, there's a lot out there. You just have to go and find them and support them. And they're all on Instagram. Like, well, not yesterday they weren't, but like, but they're on Instagram. They're out there, and they're funded, 100% funded by Black-owned VCs, immigrant-owned VCs, and it's a beautiful thing. There's not enough of them. They can't compete with Sequoia and Kleiner, but my hope is that as you see more of them get publicly traded, you'll start to see that change happen from the ground up.
Yeah, we have to lead, and also we have to also invest in the groundswell movement as well. So I think that's really important, being conscious consumers. So I also, in the last couple minutes that we have, I'm wondering what advice you can provide to our AdColor audience. There are many marketing, communications, media professionals, and DEI professionals in the room. Not everyone is a DEI professional, though, and some people may feel like this isn't my job, or if it's not my job, how do I transform things? Do you have maybe one thing you can share that might be helpful for someone who wants to step in or support, but maybe hasn't seen it, or a marketer who hasn't seen it as a space that they can own?
You want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
I would say there's a few. I would think it's important to be you and know your value. I mean, I think sometimes we lose sight of that, right? And I think, and to your point, yes, there's a lot around that, but there's also only so, I'm very practical, and you might not like my answer, but there's only so much we can control too. Like, I'm not gonna change Clorox, I'm not gonna change P&G, but I know my value, and I know what I can bring to the table. And that might mean I've lost out on a lot of opportunities. I know for a fact I have. I've heard about it later on because of how I interviewed and how I looked and whatnot. But I think that is important, to know your value, have confidence that, and when you're negotiating, whether it's coming in or when you're there, like, you know what, it's a different time. And yes, we're not anywhere near where we need to be, but 2021, I think, feels different than 2015, 2014. So I do think as an individual person, this is more about the negotiation, like, know your value. And if you get to that final offer stage and you give them a number, whenever you're at the number, and they want you, like, they want you, they're not gonna pull the offer. So up that number by 20%, 30%. The worst case, they'll say no. Best case, they might meet you exactly at your numbers. But I feel like that's something you can, as individuals, you could do right now. Just know your value, know your worth, and up it. Because I guarantee you that white man across the street is going to do that, because that's ingrained in him. So I just think that's something that I would advise anyone. I do mentor a lot of individuals, and that's the first thing I say is, like, up that number and negotiate for yourself coming in, and don't let anyone talk you down off that.
Yeah. Okay, I would say we can't let this work be siloed, right? So right now it's still kind of siloed. It's DEI work, the chief diversity officer does it, or that committee does it, rather than it really being a part of the whole company, everything we do, every team, every department, every day, everybody. So I feel like that is really a core piece of it. And especially when we see when it's put over in this one bucket of, like, okay, the equity stuff, that's what they do. It's also devalued. Like, they don't always have the power, the resources, the things that they really need to actually make the work, impactful. And really, it's the people really across the organizations who need to be carrying out that mission and those goals too. So there's just so many people who say they believe. I would like those people who say they believe the 80+%, 85%. I would like them taking these steps and really taking that ownership, not only believing in it, but taking the actions in everything they do every day across the organization rather than just like putting it off on someone else.
Great. Thank you so much. Know your worth. Ask for what you deserve. And then also equity should be across everything, infused into everything you do, in the DNA of everything you do. And I would just add, as marketers, we're stewards of the brand, and that includes every aspect of the brand, including all of your stakeholders, current, future employees, everything. So everyone join me in giving Jamila and Jackson a round of applause.
It's fun.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, and enjoy the rest of the event.